The stagecoach wheel cracked against a rut in the road so violently that Edna Dalton's inkwell flew from her lap and shattered against the opposite seat, staining the worn leather a deep, furious blue, and she pressed her lips together, looked down at her ruined traveling skirt and thought, "Perfect, just perfect. This is exactly how an adventure begins." It was the spring of 1878, and the territory of Colorado was not yet the sort of place a 26-year-old woman from Boston traveled to alone. Edna knew this. She had been told this, repeatedly and with great theatrical concern, by her editor at the Eastern Illustrated Gazette, a man named Gerald Fitch who wore his worry like a second waistcoat. He had paced his office while she sat calmly across from his desk with her notebook open in her lap, pen already inked, ready to write down whatever assignment he gave her, because Edna Dalton did not pace. She planned. The assignment was this: travel to the mining settlements and frontier towns springing up along the base of the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado, and write a series of human interest stories for the Gazette's growing readership. The paper had recently begun publishing longer feature articles, real stories with real people in them, not just dry reporting about railroad legislation or cattle prices. Gerald Fitch, for all his worry, had a good nose for what readers wanted, and what readers wanted, he had decided, were stories about the people carving lives out of wild land. He just had not expected his best writer to volunteer herself as the one to go get those stories. Edna had not been surprised by her own willingness. She had spent 3 years writing from a small desk in a Boston office building, translating other reporters' notes into elegant prose, which was a polite way of saying she rewrote sloppy men's work and received partial credit for it. She was good at her job, genuinely and indisputably good, and she knew it, and Gerald Fitch knew it, and the readers who wrote letters to the Gazette commenting on particular articles that happened to always be hers, knew it too, even if they did not know her name specifically. She had grown tired of the desk and the city and the smell of printer's ink on other people's stories. She wanted her own. So she had packed 2 trunks, one with sensible clothes and one with everything she needed to write: paper, pens, 6 inkwells wrapped individually in cotton cloth, a portable writing board that her father had made for her when she was 14, and had declared her intention to be a journalist, a declaration he had taken seriously because he was a printer himself and understood the power of words. Her father had died 2 winters ago, and the writing board went everywhere with her now, a solid piece of polished oak with a leather strap, and a small brass corner she had repaired herself with a riveting tool. It was the most important thing she owned. The stagecoach had departed from the rail terminus at Alamosa 3 days ago, and the road, if one could be generous enough to call it that, had grown progressively less civil as the miles accumulated. The country around her was extraordinary and merciless in equal measure. She had pressed her face to the window and watched pine forests climb the mountain slopes in dark, dense columns, watched rivers run bright and fast over gray stone, watched hawks hang motionless in air so clear it seemed like glass. She had filled half a notebook already just with observations, quick sentences she would expand later, the kind of details that made a reader feel they were standing beside her in the cold mountain wind. The 2 other passengers in the coach were a hardware merchant named Abner Coles, who slept with his mouth open for most of the journey, and a minister's wife named Mrs. Hartley, who had been politely horrified by Edna's profession from the moment Edna mentioned it, and had spent the better part of 2 days asking pointed questions about whether Edna had family expecting her, as though a woman riding alone in the mountains was a problem requiring urgent spiritual intervention. Edna had answered patiently and honestly. No, she had no family expecting her specifically. Yes, she knew the territory could be dangerous. No, she was not afraid, not in any way that would stop her from going. The stagecoach pulled into the town of Garnet Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, when the sky was a blue so vivid it looked painted, and the mountains behind the town were still wearing their winter snow on the high peaks like old crowns they had not yet gotten around to putting away. Garnet Creek was not a large town. It had the necessities: a general store, a telegraph office that doubled as a post office, a livery stable, a hotel of dubious comfort called the Ponderosa House, a saloon called the Silver Lode, a small church whose roof needed repair, and a scattering of homes and cabins fanning out from a central unpaved main street that was currently a rich brown mud from the spring runoff. It also had, as Edna learned within the first 2 hours of arriving and setting her trunk down in the cramped, cold room she had rented at the Ponderosa House, a serious noise problem. The Silver Lode operated at full volume from mid-afternoon through the late hours of the night. The room directly above hers housed a miner who rose at 4 in the morning and appeared to put on his boots by dropping them individually on the floor from a significant height. The wall between her room and the next was thin enough that she could hear every word of the argument a couple was having about whether to sell their wagon or repair it. And through the single window which faced the main street came the constant sound of horses, wagons, shouted conversations. A dog that had decided the street directly outside was his personal territory and worth defending against all comers. Edna sat at the small table that served as a desk, opened her writing board, laid out her paper, unstoppered a fresh inkwell, dipped her pen, and wrote exactly 4 words before the miner above her dropped something considerably heavier than a boot. She closed her eyes, breathed, and told herself this was manageable. By the end of her second day, she had managed approximately 2 pages of usable writing, which was not nothing but was a fraction of what she was capable of when the world cooperated. She had managed it by rising at 5 in the morning and writing in the brief window before the town woke up, and then spending the rest of the day conducting interviews, which she was genuinely good at. People talked to Edna. They always had. She had a quality of attention, a way of listening that made people feel heard rather than studied, and it had served her well as a journalist because people told her things they would not tell a less attentive ear. She had spoken to 2 miners about the conditions in the copper claim operations up in the hills. She had spoken to the woman who ran the general store, a sharp-minded widow named Mrs. Peck who had opinions about everything and the sales records to back most of them up. She had spoken to the town's only doctor, a young man named Dr. Aldous Briggs who was 28, freshly graduated, and managing a patient load that would have exhausted a more experienced man, which was exactly the kind of story her readers would appreciate. She had not spoken to Silas Slater, but she had noticed him. It was difficult not to notice Silas Slater. He was the sort of man who occupied more space than just his physical dimensions would suggest, and his physical dimensions were already considerable. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that came not from a gymnasium, but from years of actual, hard physical work in demanding country. His shoulders were broad in a way that made the doorframe of the general store look like it had been sized incorrectly when he walked through it, and the flannel shirt he wore, rolled to the elbows despite the cool April air, showed forearms corded with muscle in a way that Edna, who considered herself a disciplined and professional observer of things, found herself observing longer than was strictly necessary for journalistic purposes. His hair was dark brown and longer than most men in town wore theirs, not unkempt, just uncut in the way of a man who did not spend a great deal of time concerned with barbershops, and it curled slightly at the ends where it brushed his collar. His jaw was covered in a dark beard, neat at the edges and full in the middle, and his eyes, which she caught a glimpse of when he glanced in her direction outside the general store, were a pale, striking gray-green, the color of the river on a cloudy morning. He carried 2 large crates of supplies from the general store to a heavy wagon with the ease of someone lifting hat boxes, which was so absurdly effortless that Edna stopped walking and watched him do it. He loaded the wagon, checked the horses with the practiced attention of a man who trusted animals more than he was comfortable saying, climbed up onto the seat, and drove away without looking back at the street. He had not spoken to anyone while he was there. Mrs. Peck had simply had the crates ready at the door when he arrived, as though his order and its timing were already known and agreed upon. Edna asked Mrs. Peck about him that afternoon. "Silas Slater," Mrs. Peck said, restacking a row of tin cans with the efficient motion of long habit. "Lives up on the mountain, about 8 miles north up toward Greer's Ridge. Comes into town once a fortnight for supplies, sometimes less. Does some trapping, some timber work for the mines, some guiding when someone needs it. Keeps mostly to himself. Does he own land up there? His own cabin on about 40 acres, I believe. Been there 6, 7 years. Came from Wyoming originally, I think, though he doesn't talk about it much. Doesn't talk about much, period." She set the last can in place and looked at Edna with the sharp assessment that was apparently her default expression. "Why do you ask?" "I'm looking for stories," Edna said, which was true, though she was aware it was not the entire truth of why she had asked. "Well, Silas Slater's not a man who'll give you one easily," Mrs. Peck said. "But if you could get him talking, it'd be worth hearing." On her third night in Garnet Creek, Edna lay awake listening to the silver lode in full operation below and thought seriously about her situation. She was already behind on her writing. Her editor expected the first installment in 3 weeks, and she had interviews but not the finished prose, and the finished prose required quiet, and quiet was something Garnet Creek did not reliably offer. She had good material. She had a notebook full of observations and conversations and details. What she did not have was the sustained, unbroken concentration required to turn those raw materials into the kind of writing she was proud of. She also found herself thinking, in the spaces between her more productive thoughts, about pale gray-green eyes and the casual, remarkable ease with which a man had lifted 2 large crates as though they weighed nothing at all. She told herself this was merely the brain making associations between things that had recently occupied her attention. She was a practical woman. She understood that she was 26 years old and had not been particularly close to anyone in the 2 years since her father died, and that loneliness, even the kind a person could manage and function with, still left a person occasionally susceptible to noticing a broad-shouldered man with interesting eyes. She told herself this, rolled over, pulled the blanket up, and listened to the miner above her apparently rearranging his entire room at 11:30 at night. The next morning, she had a problem she had not anticipated. She had run out of the particular weight of paper she preferred for her longer writing, having used more of it for notes than she had planned. The general store carried paper, but not the kind she needed, and Mrs. Peck, when Edna inquired, said that the supply wagon from Alamosa was not due for another 10 days. Edna was standing outside the store calculating her options when the heavy wagon pulled up, and Silas Slater climbed down from the seat with the easy movement of a large man who had spent considerable time on and off horses and wagons and was completely comfortable with his own body. He was wearing the same flannel shirt, or an identical one, and a canvas jacket over it against the morning chill, and he had a hat on this time, a broad-brimmed brown hat that had clearly seen several years of actual weather rather than decoration. He glanced at her once, registered her presence in a neutral way, and started toward the store door. "Excuse me," Edna said. He stopped and looked at her again, this time with the attention of someone who had decided she was worth answering. "Ma'am." "You're Silas Slater." "I am." His voice was lower than she had expected, unhurried with a texture to it like good timber, solid and warm at the grain. "I'm Edna Dalton. I'm a journalist, writing for the Eastern Illustrated Gazette. I've been told you know this territory well." He studied her for a moment without speaking. She noticed that his gaze was direct but not aggressive, the way a man looked when he was genuinely thinking about something rather than just stalling. "What kind of writing?" he asked. "Human interest stories, the people making lives out here, the real experience of it." He considered this. Not the sensational kind. The kind that makes a traveling circus of other people's hardship. She liked the question. It told her something specific and useful about him. "Not if I can help it," she said honestly. "I'm interested in what people's lives actually are, not what makes the most dramatic headline." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded, a small, single motion that seemed to settle something internally. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to you sometime." "I would appreciate that." She hesitated because she had not been planning to say the next part, but the situation with her writing was genuinely problematic and she was practical above being proud. "I have another question that is not about an interview. I'm having trouble writing at the hotel. The noise is significant. I was wondering whether you might know of a quieter place nearby, somewhere I could work for a few hours each day without being interrupted every 4 minutes." Something changed in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening of the careful neutrality he wore. "The Ponderosa house is pretty loud," he agreed. "That is a considerable understatement." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance somewhere over her shoulder. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 1.5 miles up the North Trail. Hasn't been used regular in a couple years. I check it now and then, make sure the roof's holding. It's quiet. Good light in the morning." He paused. "I could bring you up there if you want to take a look at it." She met his eyes and found them steady and without any of the particular qualities she had learned to watch for in men who offered things they expected payment for in one form or another. His offer was simply an offer, clean and straightforward. "That would be very kind," she said. He nodded again. "I need to pick up my order. 20 minutes." True to his word, he came back out of the store 20 minutes later with his crates loaded in the wagon, and a look that said he was ready when she was. She had retrieved her writing board and her current notebook from the hotel in the meantime, on the logic that if the cabin suited her, she might as well stay and write this morning. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him with rather less grace than she would have preferred, given that the wagon seat was higher than it looked, and he offered a hand without making anything of it. Just a large, steady hand she took hold of to haul herself up. The road north out of Garnet Creek turned into a trail that turned into something more like a suggestion after about a half-mile, climbing through pine and spruce forest where the air changed quality entirely, becoming cooler and sharper and absolutely, blessedly free of the smell of the Silver Lode's particular brand of industry. The mountains rose ahead of them, and Edna turned her face toward the view and felt something in her chest ease that had been tight since she arrived. "It's beautiful up here," she said. "Yes," he agreed. There was nothing performative about the way he said it, no attempt to expand the sentiment into something more conversational. He simply agreed because it was true, and that was enough. The cabin was small and solid, built from rough-hewn pine logs with a stone chimney and a single window facing east toward the morning light, exactly as he had said. Inside it was one room with a stone hearth, a heavy wooden table, a simple chair, and a narrow bunk in the back corner with a rolled mattress on it. It smelled of pine and old wood smoke, and the particular clean, cold smell of a place that had been closed for the winter and was just beginning to remember spring. Edna stood in the center of the room and listened. The only sounds were the wind in the pines outside, a creek somewhere not far away running over rocks, and the distant percussion of a woodpecker in the forest. The light came through the east window in a long, warm band and fell directly across the table. "This is perfect," she said, and she meant it from someplace deep and genuine. He had been watching her from the doorway. "Roof's sound," he said. "I fixed it last fall. Chimney draws clean. I can bring some wood by, enough for a fire in the mornings while it's still cold." She turned to look at him. He was filling the doorframe in the way he apparently filled all doorframes, shoulders nearly touching the sides, the mountain light behind him and the cool interior light falling on his face, and she thought that he was a remarkably self-contained man, which was the most useful kind. "You do that?" she asked. "Cabin's just sitting here," he said. "May as well be used." They agreed on an informal arrangement that morning, the sort of agreement that required no document because both parties were honest and they both understood that. Edna would use the cabin for writing from early morning until midday, at which point she would return to town for her afternoon interviews. Silas would stop by to ensure the wood supply was maintained and that the cabin remained in good order, which he would have been doing anyway. There was no exchange of money because neither of them suggested it, and the omission felt natural and right. She stayed that morning and wrote for 4 uninterrupted hours, seated at the heavy table with her writing board and her pen and the east light moving slowly across the page as the morning progressed, and she produced 8 pages of clean, finished prose, which was more than she had produced in the previous 3 days combined. The story was about Mrs. Peck and the general store and what it meant to be a woman running a business in a frontier town in 1878. And it was good. She knew it was good. The kind of writing that had texture and warmth and a real person at the center of it. When she finally set her pen down and stretched her hands, she realized she was happier than she had been in several months, which was a thought that arrived with a certain quiet force. She walked back to town through the pine forest with her notebook under her arm, and the smell of wood smoke in her hair from the small fire she had built to warm the cabin against the morning chill. And she thought about Silas Slater, the unhurried way he spoke, the way he had looked at her when she said she was not interested in sensational stories, the steady hand he had offered without any secondary agenda. She also thought about the fact that she would be in Garnet Creek for approximately 6 more weeks and had a great deal of work to accomplish, and that getting distracted by a mountain man she had known for one morning was not a productive use of her time. This was a very sensible thought. She had it twice more on the way back to town, which was probably twice more than a sensible thought needed to be repeated. Silas came by the cabin the following morning before she arrived, which she discovered because there was a fresh stack of split wood beside the hearth, and the fire had already been laid, ready to light, with a box of matches sitting on top. This was so straightforwardly thoughtful that she sat down in the chair for a moment before she did anything else, looking at the fire she had just lit catching and growing, and felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. Over the following 2 weeks, she established a rhythm that suited her deeply. She walked the 1.5 miles from town to the cabin each morning at just past first light, let herself in, lit the fire, and wrote until the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Then she walked back, ate something at the small eating house attached to the Ponderosa Hotel, and spent her afternoons gathering material. She rode with the doctor out to a homestead family's place 12 miles east, and wrote about the particular loneliness and dignity of frontier medicine. She interviewed 3 miners who had come from Wales and were building a small community within the larger community, holding onto their language and their music in a land that had never heard either before. She found an elderly Ute man named Henry, who had English and was willing to talk about what the land had been and what it was becoming, and she listened for an entire afternoon and filled her notebook, and understood that she was holding something that needed to be written about with exceptional care. Silas was at the cabin on perhaps every 3rd morning when she arrived, either finishing up the wood stacking or checking the chimney, or, once, repairing a small section of the window frame that had begun to let in a draft. He worked without disturbing her, moving with a quietness she had not expected from a man his size, and she wrote around him the way she might write around a very large, very peaceful feature of the landscape. They talked on those mornings. Not at length, not the way people talked in drawing rooms or at social engagements, but in the unhurried, honest way of 2 people who are both comfortable with silence, and therefore do not feel the need to fill it with unnecessary words. She told him about her work, about the specific challenge of writing about real people with both accuracy and generosity. He told her about the mountain, about the way it changed through the seasons, about the bear that had taken up residence near the North Creek 3 summers ago, and had been a significant philosophical problem for 2 beehives he kept for the honey. She laughed at the bee story, a genuine, delighted laugh, and he looked at her afterward with an expression she could not entirely read, something warm and a little startled, as though laughter was something he did not hear as often as he should. "You kept bees?" she asked. "I did, the bare one in the end. There was a rueful quality to it. I'll try again next spring further from the creek." "You'll just report that to the bear, I assume. That you're starting over in a new location and to please respect the boundary this time." "I'm thinking about it," he said, with a gravity that was not quite serious, and she understood that he was, in his way, making a joke. She liked him. It was not a complicated feeling, not yet, just a clean, simple liking of the kind that required no analysis because it was self-evident. She liked his directness, his lack of pretension, the way he had an opinion about things and stated it without needing to make theater of it. She liked that he had offered her something useful without any expectation attached to it. She liked that he took her work seriously without making a production of doing so. The way some men perform tolerance for a professional woman's work, as though tolerance was itself the thing to be praised. She was also, and this she acknowledged to herself with the same practical honesty she brought to most things, increasingly aware of him in a less professional and more personal way. She noticed the way his hands moved when he worked, large and precise, the knuckles scarred from years of work in rough country. She noticed the way he looked at the mountain when he talked about it, with a kind of quiet reverence that she recognized because she felt the same way about good writing. She noticed that when he smiled, which was rare and therefore valuable, it changed his whole face, softened the self-contained steadiness of it into something that looked very much like joy. It was entirely inconvenient, and she wrote more excellent pages in response to the inconvenience than she had expected. At the end of her second week in Garnet Creek, a problem arrived from the direction she had least expected it. The Gazette's telegraph reached her at the hotel. Her editor, Gerald Fitch, wanted the first installment in 10 days rather than the 3 weeks they had originally agreed upon, because a competing paper had begun running a Western Frontier series, and Fitch wanted to establish the Gazette's version first. This was reasonable from his perspective and deeply irritating from hers, because 10 days meant she needed to write faster than she had planned, which meant longer mornings at the cabin, which meant less time for the afternoon interviews she still needed to do, which meant compressing both halves of her work simultaneously. She sent a reply by telegraph agreeing to it, because she had agreed to write the series and she would write it, even if she had to get up at 4 in the morning to do so. She was composing the telegraph reply on a piece of paper at the hotel's front desk, when a man came through the door of the Ponderosa house loudly, and without greeting the proprietor, Mr. Lund, who ran the place with the patient weariness of a man who had not expected the frontier hospitality business to be this complicated. The new arrival was a broad man in a good coat, traveling salesman quality, with a face that had seen too much sun and not enough scruple, and he looked at Edna at the desk with the particular attention of a man who has decided that a woman alone is an opportunity. His name, she learned from the register book that he signed with unnecessary flourish, was Wade Hennessy, and he was a land broker who traveled the circuit of frontier towns selling promissory investments in mining operations that were, based on everything Edna had learned from actual miners in her 2 weeks in Garnet Creek, approximately half as profitable as advertised, and sometimes entirely fictional. Hennessy positioned himself at the hotel's small sitting area and made a point of speaking to Edna, addressing her with the assumption of familiarity that she found immediately objectionable. She answered him in short, polite sentences designed to discourage conversation, which he either did not notice or chose to ignore. She mentioned it to Silas the next morning because they had fallen into the habit of sharing a cup of coffee when he was at the cabin, she having taken to bringing a small tin pot and beans in her bag, and it seemed relevant to mention. "Hennessy," Silas said. He was looking at the fire rather than at her, but she could see his jaw tight. "I know him. He came through here 18 months ago, and sold two of the miners up at the Pemberton claim a share in a smelting operation that turned out to not exist in the form advertised. Did they get their money back? No, he said it flatly without extra elaboration, which was somehow more revealing than a longer explanation would have been. He doesn't seem to recognize the name Garnet Creek as a place he should avoid, Edna said. He'll move on in a few days when he's done his damage. He usually does. He looked at her then, and there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that she read as a quiet statement of something, not quite a promise, but something like readiness. You'll want to keep your distance. He's the type that reads courtesy as permission. I know the type, she said. I've been in newsrooms. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but acknowledged that she had made a fair point. I imagine you have. She looked at him over her coffee cup. You don't think I can handle myself. I think you can handle yourself fine, he said, without hesitation, meeting her gaze. I'm saying you shouldn't have to, and if he gives you trouble, I'd like to know about it. This was so simply and directly said that she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. She looked down at her coffee. All right, she said. Hennessy did not give her serious trouble, though he tried for the better part of 3 days, appearing wherever she happened to be in town and attempting conversation with the persistence of a man who believed that persistence itself was charming. He made the particular mistake, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, of following her from the general store to the telegraph office and standing in the doorway while she was trying to compose a message, talking about himself in a way designed to impress and succeeding only in being thoroughly in the way. Silas happened to come into town that afternoon for a supply he had forgotten, which was unusual since he rarely came into town more than fortnightly. And he came around the corner of the telegraph office to find Hennessy in the doorway and Edna's expression doing something controlled and patient that he apparently read correctly, because he stopped behind Hennessy and said, very quietly, "Afternoon, Hennessy." Hennessy turned around, looked up at Silas Slater, took a precise inventory of the situation, and stepped aside from the telegraph office doorway with a suddenly cooperative air. "Slater," he said, "Miss Dalton working?" Silas asked with the same quiet and without any particular emphasis. "Sure," Hennessy said. "I was just on my way." He left with admirable efficiency, and Silas watched him go and then looked at Edna. "All right," he asked. "Better now, thank you," she said. He nodded. He did not make it bigger than it was, did not turn it into a demonstration of anything, just checked that she was fine and prepared to move on. She appreciated this more than she could easily say. Hennessy departed from Garnet Creek 2 days later, having apparently found enough invested locals, and moved on down his circuit. The town relaxed slightly without knowing exactly why, the way a room adjusts when someone inconvenient leaves it. Edna sent her first installment to the Gazette by a combination of telegraph for the notification and carefully wrapped papers on the next mail coach. And then she sat in the cabin on the morning after sending it, with the east light on the table and the creek running outside, and felt the particular combination of satisfaction and anxiety that followed every piece of writing she sent away. Had she done justice to Mrs. Peck's sharpness and dignity? Had she written about the Welsh miners with enough understanding of what they had left and what they were building? Had she handled Henry's perspective with the care it deserved? She was running through this quietly when the door opened and Silas came in with an armload of wood, read her expression without any difficulty, and set the wood down beside the hearth. "First piece sent," he asked. "Yesterday afternoon." "Hard part is waiting now," he said. "The hardest part," she agreed. "I've done this enough times that you'd think I would be comfortable with the uncertainty by now." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you think the work was good?" She considered the question with the same seriousness he had asked it. "I think it's some of the best I've written," she said honestly. "Then you know," he said simply, and turned to stack the wood with the same efficient motion she had watched enough times now to find familiar and oddly comforting. She looked at his back for a moment, the width of his shoulders against the small cabin's wall, and thought that this was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and that in her experience this was a rarer quality than it should be. "Silas," she said. He turned. Thank you for the cabin. It's made everything possible that I hope to do here." He held her gaze for a beat longer than the strictly conversational, and something shifted in the quality of the air in the small room, the way the air changes before weather. "Glad," he said, and then with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular kind of courage, the kind that hid itself in very simple words. "I like knowing you're up here writing." She absorbed this. "Why?" she asked, not to challenge it, just because she genuinely wanted to know. He looked at the wall for a moment and then back at her, and the careful neutrality he maintained as a kind of default was not entirely present. "Because you're doing something that matters to you, and you're good at it. And you don't need anyone to tell you that you're allowed to be good at it." He stopped. "Not many people get to do the thing they're meant to do. You are." The sincerity of it sat in the room between them like the warmth from the fire, and Edna Dalton, who had written about dozens of people's lives and inner worlds, and had always been better at capturing other people's feelings than she was at navigating her own, found that she had no immediate words. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in several years," she said finally. "I expect that's a problem with the company you've been keeping," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not a criticism, just an observation, that made her suddenly aware that they were two people standing in a small cabin in a pine forest on a mountain in Colorado, and that the distance between them was not particularly large, and that she was having no difficulty maintaining eye contact with him at all. She was saved from whatever she might have said next by the woodpecker in the pine outside, which chose that precise moment to begin an enthusiastic and highly audible campaign against a section of bark, and the sound broke the particular quality of the moment without destroying the warmth of it, and they both registered this with something close to relief and something else that was close to its opposite. "I should write," she said. "I'll be out of your way," he said, and was. She wrote 8 more pages that morning, and they were very good, and she attributed this entirely to the excellent light and the quality of the quiet and not at all to anything else. The weeks took on a shape she had not anticipated when she arrived in Garnet Creek, a shape that was partly professional and partly something she was still finding words for. She wrote in the mornings in the cabin, and the writing was producing the best work of her career. She interviewed in the afternoons, gathering more material than she had originally planned for, enough for a longer series than she had proposed, which she had already begun corresponding with Gerald Fitch about. He had responded to her first installment with a telegram that read, "Exceptional stop readers demanding more stop. How many pieces can you deliver stop?" She could deliver as many pieces as this territory had stories, which was a considerable number. Silas was part of the shape of things now. He came to the cabin 2 or 3 times a week, and they shared the mornings in the companionable way of people who have discovered that they occupy the same space easily, without friction or effort. She asked him once about Wyoming, where Mrs. Peck had said he was from, and he talked about it carefully, the way a person talks about something they have resolved but not entirely set down. He had come from a ranch in the Laramie Basin, he said, where he had worked for his early 20s. He had come west, then farther west and higher, after a winter that he described simply as a hard one, and she understood from the economy of that description that there was more to it, but that he had decided what was his to carry and what was his to tell. She told him about Boston, about her father's print shop and the smell of it, hot metal and ink and paper, the particular sound of the press running, which she had fallen asleep to as a child the way other children fell asleep to lullabies. She told him about 3 years of writing other men's stories under the shadow of their names, and about the slow, building decision to stop doing that and come west and write her own. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention that she had recognized in him from nearly the beginning, the kind that made a person feel genuinely received rather than merely heard. "Your father would be proud of what you're doing," he said, after she had told him about the writing board and where it came from. She felt the familiar ache that she had learned to carry without letting it stop her. "I believe he would," she said. "He always said that words were the most important tools ever made." More important than any machine, because a machine can only do the thing it was built for, but a word can do 100 things depending on how you put it. Silas was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man. He was, she said. The best one I ever knew. She paused. Until recently, possibly. She had not intended to say that last part out loud. It arrived before she could consider it, and once it was in the air there was nothing to do about it but keep looking at the east light and wait to see what he did with it. What he did with it was go very still, the way a mountain goes still, not absent but extraordinarily present, and she could feel that stillness from across the room. "Edna," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that pale gray-green gaze, and the thing she had been watching build in it for weeks now was entirely visible, no longer held carefully behind the careful neutrality he wore by habit. "I need to say something," he said, "and I don't want to make you uncomfortable in a place that's supposed to be where you can work." "You won't," she said, with the certainty of someone who genuinely believed it. He turned toward her fully from where he had been standing at the hearth, and the morning light put him in strong relief, his shoulders and his face and the careful way he was holding himself, like a man who has something important to say and is taking the time to say it right. "I've been coming up here more than the wood supply strictly requires," he said, "and I think you know that." "I do," she said. "I've spent a considerable amount of time over the last few weeks thinking about the fact that you'll be leaving here when your work is done." He said this plainly, but she heard what was underneath it. "And I find that I have a significant objection to that." She took a breath. "What kind of objection?" "The kind that would like to give you a reason to stay," he said. "Or at the least, a reason to come back." The cabin was very quiet, the creek outside and the pine wind and nothing else, and Edna Dalton looked at Silas Slater and felt the whole neat structure of the practical, professional plan she had arrived in Colorado with shift slightly on its foundations. Not collapse, not fail, just adjust to include something it had not originally accounted for. "I came here with a specific purpose," she said, not as a rebuff but as a true statement that deserved acknowledgement. "My work matters to me. It will always matter to me." "I know that," he said without a flicker of hesitation. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "You say that," she said carefully, because she had had enough experience of men who said such things and meant them differently. But a man who keeps a woman busy at domestic things has a way of being surprised later to find she stopped writing. He held her gaze. "I say it because I mean it," he said. "I've watched you write for weeks. I've watched what it is for you. I would no sooner ask you to stop than ask the creek to stop running." He paused. "Besides," he said, and the something that was almost but not quite a smile was back at the corner of his mouth, "I like reading what you write. I'd like more of it, not less." She was quiet for a moment. "You've read my work." Mrs. Peck got a copy of the Gazette from the Alamosa Mail last week. First installment. I read it twice. He was not embarrassed about this. "You wrote about people here the way they actually are, not flattened down for the ease of a reader who's never seen this country. Real." She felt something move in her chest that was not entirely professional in nature. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean the other thing I said too," he said. "The objection to you leaving." She looked at him for a long time in the morning light. This man who had offered her a quiet place to work without asking for anything in return, who had listened to her talk about her father and her work and her ambitions with the full weight of his attention, who had stood behind Wade Hennessy in a doorway and made a problem resolve itself through the sheer power of being who he was, who kept bees and lost them to a bear and planned to try again, who knew this mountain the way she knew language and was willing to share both. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make any decisions about leaving," she said slowly, "that I haven't fully thought through." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not asking for a decision. I'm asking if I'm allowed to hope." She stood up from the chair, which put her in the middle of the cabin and considerably closer to him than the table had been, and she looked up at him and thought that she was, at this moment, in the most precise and honest and clear-sighted conversation about the possibility of love she had ever been in her life. "Yes," she said. You're allowed to hope." He reached out and very carefully, very gently, as though she were something valuable that deserved to be handled with the same precision he brought to everything. He tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear where it had come loose from its pin. His fingers were warm against her cheek, and the contact lasted barely 2 seconds and said everything. She wrote absolutely nothing for the rest of that morning and did not mind at all. The days that followed had the quality of something building, the way weather builds over the mountains with increasing conviction, not threatening but inevitable, the kind of coming thing a person watches with more anticipation than dread. She and Silas did not rush anything. They were both, by nature, people who understood that good things had their own pace and were not improved by forcing them. And there was a particular pleasure in the slow, deliberate discovery of a person, in the conversations that moved from practical to personal, to something more central and true. He took her on horseback one clear morning in the middle of May up to a meadow at the top of the ridge above his cabin, and she saw the full sweep of the San Juan range laid out in the early light, with the snow peaks burning gold and pink and impossible. And she understood why he had come here and stayed, why the hard winter in Wyoming had led him north and west and up until he found country equal to whatever it was he carried. "You never talk about the hard winter," she said, on the way down from the ridge, their horses walking easy through the pines. He was quiet for a moment. "My brother died that winter," he said. "Accident at the ranch. We were working a fence line in a storm I thought we could finish before it got bad." He said this looking at the trail ahead, his voice steady but the steadiness costing something. It got bad. He was 23. She absorbed this without rushing anything. "His name? Daniel." A pause. "He would have been my age now." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the full and simple way of genuine sorrow. "I came up here because being on a flat ranch where everything looked like the place it happened was more than I could manage," he said. "The mountains don't look like anything but themselves." It helped. She understood this on the level of her bones. "My father's shop was sold when he died," she said. "I couldn't have worked there even if I'd wanted to, too much of him and the smell of it." They rode for a while in the companionable silence that had become native to them, the pines opening and closing around the trail. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "Not to the ranch," he said. "No." He glanced at her sideways, and the morning light caught his face, the beard and the jaw and those eyes that she had spent weeks learning. "There's more here I want to stay for now than there used to be." She did not pretend she did not know what he meant. She looked at the trail ahead and smiled, a real smile, the whole face kind. Gerald Fitch sent another telegram at the end of May asking when she was coming home, and when she could expect to deliver the remaining installments. She drafted her reply with considerable care, sitting at the table in the cabin with the afternoon sun through the window for a change, since she had stayed later than usual that day deep in a piece about the Ute elder Henry that she felt was possibly the most important writing she had ever done. She told Fitch she needed another 6 weeks. She told him the series had expanded significantly in scope and that the material justified a longer treatment. She told him she was sending the second and third installments with the next mail coach. She did not tell him about the man who cut wood for her fireplace and had read her first article twice and kept bees on a mountain in the San Juan range. She told Silas about the telegram that evening. She had, over the past few weeks, begun spending some evenings at his cabin rather than at the Ponderosa house, which was an entirely sensible decision, based on the fact that his cabin was considerably quieter than the hotel, and he cooked remarkably well for a man who had been feeding himself alone for 7 years, producing stews from fresh-caught trout and dried herbs and mountain vegetables that were better than anything the hotel's small eating establishment offered. These were practical reasons. They were not the only reasons. 6 more weeks, he said. He was looking at the fire in his hearth, a larger, more comfortable hearth than the one in the trapper's cabin, in a larger room with more of the quality of a life being lived in it, bookshelves made from split logs, a rifle on the wall above the door, a good thick rug on the floor that he had brought back from a Lamosa the winter before. At least, she said, the material keeps growing. Good, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to say anything more than that. He turned his head to look at her where she was sitting across from him in the other chair. I could say that I'm glad for every additional day. Would that be redundant at this point? No, she said. I don't think it would. He held her gaze with those clear, pale eyes, and she thought that she had come to Colorado for ambition and for words and had found, as the very best surprises tend to arrive, something she had not known she was looking for. She moved across the room to where he was sitting and he rose to meet her, because he was that kind of man, and she put her hand against his chest and felt the solid, warm reality of him, the heartbeat steady under her palm. And when he kissed her, it was entirely like him, unhurried and certain and entirely genuine, the kind of kiss that does not need to announce itself because it already knows what it is. They stood in the firelight of his cabin with the mountain outside and the pines in the creek, and she thought, yes, this is exactly right. The weeks after that had a different quality, the particular warm brightness of a life that has grown to include another person in ways you did not plan but cannot imagine undoing. She still wrote every morning. She wrote better, she thought, if anything, because happiness is not the enemy of good prose. It is the enemy of a particular kind of brittle cleverness, but real warmth and real feeling make for real writing, and Edna's writing had more of both in it now. She finished the piece about Henry the Ute Elder, and it was, she believed, the finest thing she had written in her career. She sent it with a careful note to Fitch explaining that it required sensitivity in the editing, and that any cuts needed to be approved by her. Fitch telegraphed back that he would handle it personally. She chose to believe him. She wrote about the Welsh miners and their music, about the doctor who worked himself to exhaustion for a settlement that could not really afford to pay him, about the families in the homestead cabins east of town, managing distances and winters and loneliness with a practicality that was its own form of heroism. She wrote about the land itself, about what it asked of the people who chose it and what it gave back, and the writing was informed by everything she had learned in her months in Colorado, including what she had learned in the evenings by a cabin fire in the San Juans. Silas read every piece as she finished it. He read carefully and did not offer corrections or suggestions unless she asked, because he understood that it was her work and not his. But when she asked, he gave honest answers, and his eye for what was true and what was constructed was reliable in a way she respected. He had read more than she had expected. He told her over the years on the mountain, books ordered from the Alamosa dealer and from a catalog house in Denver. History, mostly, and natural history, and some fiction because winter was long and the nights were very dark and a person needed something that went beyond practical fact. He asked her once in late June what she wanted for her life. Not in the immediate, logistical sense of the telegram questions, but in the larger sense, the life sense, and she answered honestly because he deserved honesty, and because this was the conversation they had been moving toward for weeks. She wanted to write, she said. She wanted to write things that mattered, about real people living real lives, for as long as she could do it well. She wanted to travel for it, to see more than one corner of the country, because the country was enormous and full of stories. She wanted, she said more slowly, to have a life that contained both the work and the person, and she had not been sure until recently that such a thing was possible, not because she had not believed in it in principle, but because she had not found, until recently, a person with whom it seemed genuinely achievable. He was quiet for a while after that, looking at the dark pine branches outside his window against the July stars, and then he said, "I'm not a man who travels much. This mountain is mine and I'm its. But I could be a man who has a life that gives a woman room to go and come back if she wanted to come back." She turned to look at him fully. "Is that what you're offering?" "I'm offering," he said, with the care of a man choosing every word, "whatever makes it possible for you to have everything you need. Including this." He gestured, meaning the cabin, the mountain, the fire himself. She reached across and took his hand, large and warm and rough-palmed, in both of hers. "I want to come back," she said. "I want coming back to be the point." He turned his hand over and held hers. "Then I want to ask you something I'd like you to take time to think about properly," he said. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not this minute if you need time, not if it compromises anything you need for your work, but eventually, truly." The fire was low, and the stars were out, and the mountain was entirely itself around them. And Edna Dalton looked at this man who had cut wood for her fire, and read her articles twice, and kissed her in the firelight without any of the complicated conditions she had feared. And she thought about her father saying that words were the most important tools ever made. And she thought about the cabin with the east light and the creek sound, and the 4 uninterrupted hours on the first morning she had written there. And she thought about all the stories still to be written, in Colorado and Wyoming, and wherever the work took her, and she thought about having this particular man with his particular steadiness and his gray-green eyes and his bees to come home to. "Yes," she said, without requiring additional time. "Truly, yes." He exhaled slowly, like a man who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and can now set it down. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the backs of her fingers, and she felt it all the way to the center of her chest, warm and certain and absolutely right. They were married in the first week of August of 1878, in the small church in Garnet Creek whose roof had been repaired in the interim, as much by Silas's own labor over a weekend in June as by any other intervention. Because, when Silas Slater noticed that a roof needed fixing, he simply fixed it rather than waiting for someone else to arrange for it. The minister, a nervous young man named Reverend Cole who had arrived in town a month before and was still finding his footing, conducted the ceremony with genuine warmth and only dropped his book once. Mrs. Peck was there with a sharp, satisfied expression. Dr. Briggs was there, having delivered a baby at the homestead 12 miles east that morning and ridden directly from there, still in his working clothes, because Edna had told him he was welcome any condition. The Welsh miners came in a group and sang something after the ceremony in their own language that none of the others understood, but that moved several people to quiet tears regardless, because music in a language you do not know still carries the full weight of what it means. Silas stood at the front of the small church in the best shirt he owned, which he had ordered from the catalog house in Denver 6 weeks ago, in a dark blue that suited his coloring in a way that Mrs. Peck commented on approvingly, and he watched Edna come down the aisle in a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen in a limosa on a trip she had made for a different purpose entirely. And the expression on his face was the one she had been watching arrive in him over months, the one that the careful neutrality had been protecting all along, open and certain, and full of the kind of feeling that needed no performance because it was entirely real. She took his hand at the front of the church and looked up at him, and thought that she had arrived in Colorado with ink and ambition, and had found both the quiet place to work and the person she had not known she was also looking for, and that this was not a compromise of either thing but an expansion of both. They said what they meant to say to each other, looking at each other steadily, and the mountain outside the church windows was green and enormous in the August light, and Garnet Creek made the sounds of a small frontier town on a Tuesday in summer, horses and voices and the distant ring of metal, and none of it was too loud because none of it was inside the church, which was exactly the right kind of quiet. Edna remained in Colorado through October, finishing the last 3 installments of her series, which she completed in the trapper's cabin on the mornings, when she was not also managing the beginning of a shared domestic life with Silas, which turned out to be substantially more interesting than she had expected, because Silas was not a man who needed a woman to organize his life for him, but was very willing to have someone share it. And the difference between those two things was exactly the difference that mattered. Gerald Fitch published the complete series in the Eastern Illustrated Gazette over 6 consecutive issues in the autumn and winter of 1878, and the reader response was the largest the paper had received for any single series in a decade. Fitch wrote her a long letter that arrived in November saying so, and also asking with what she recognized as carefully managed desperation whether she would consider another Western series for the following year. She wrote back from the cabin, with the November wind in the pines outside and Silas somewhere out in the snow checking his traps, and said yes, she would, and that she had several ideas, and that her base of operations was now in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado rather than Boston, and that this would not interfere with her delivery schedule and in fact might improve it, given that she had access to a very superior writing situation. She did not say that the writing situation included a man who had built her a proper desk in the cabin, a real desk, not the heavy table that had served her all summer, but an actual writing desk with a shallow drawer for her pens, and a slight angle to the surface that she had mentioned once, months ago, was easier on her wrists, and that he had remembered and built it without telling her, and she had found it one morning in November with a note in his careful handwriting that said, "For the next 100 stories." She had sat at the desk for a long time before she wrote anything, looking at the east light and the wood grain of the surface, and felt a happiness that was not simple. Nothing real was simple, but was complete. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a good one, by mountain standards. Silas had been right that the mountain was different in winter, the world compressing into the warm circle of the cabin, and the immediate practicalities of staying fed and warm, in a landscape that did not concern itself with human comfort. And Edna, who had thought herself a person of cities and editorial offices, discovered that she was also a person of mountains and wood stoves, and the particular satisfaction of a day spent between good physical work and good writing. She wrote 2 shorter pieces that winter for the Gazette, a different kind of writing than the summer series, more intimate and interior, about the experience of a winter on the mountain, about what the quiet and the snow and the cold did to a person's sense of time and self. Fitch published them both and noted in a letter that her voice had changed subtly from the summer pieces, gained something he could not exactly name, but that made the winter pieces feel like they came from somewhere deeper. She knew what it was. She knew where deeper had come from. In the spring of 1879, when the snow was leaving the lower slopes and the creek was running loud and fast with the melt, she confirmed what she had begun to suspect in February. She was going to have a child. She told Silas on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen of the cabin while he was making coffee, and she watched the information arrive in him, saw his face move through the brief transit from surprise to something that was not quite describable, somewhere between reverence and an enormous, completely undefended joy. And he set the coffee pot down and turned fully toward her and gathered her against him, very carefully, very securely, and held on. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice rough in a way it almost never was. "I'm very well," she said into his chest. "Happy." "Good," he said. "Good." He held her for a long time in the spring morning, and she listened to his heartbeat and the coffee beginning to bubble on the stove and the creek outside and the woodpecker, which was back this year and apparently committed to the same section of pine it had been working on last spring, and she thought, all right then. This is the life. This is all of it, the work and the love and the place and the future, and it is everything and it is mine. Dr. Riggs, when she went to see him in town the following week, confirmed her own assessment with his professional one, pronounced her excellent health with the exhausted but genuine warmth of a young doctor who loved his work despite everything it asked of him, and said that based on his calculation she could expect a child in October or November. "I'll come to you when the time comes," he said. "I know the trail to Slater's place." "I know you do," she said. "I'm grateful for it. Are you going to keep writing?" He asked, not with any negative intent, just the honest curiosity of someone who had read her series and was interested. "Until the morning of, if the writing cooperates," she said, which made him laugh. the startled laugh of someone who has been given exactly the honest answer they needed. The months of that pregnancy were the most productive writing months of her life to that point, which she found somewhat mystical and was willing to simply accept as a gift. She was writing a new series for the Gazette about the women of the frontier West, not the sensational versions of those women but the actual ones, the homesteaders and the business owners, and the doctors' wives who were quietly also practicing medicine, because the frontier did not always give you the luxury of limiting what you were willing to do. She had more material than she could use. She had a waiting readership and a desk built for her specifically, and a mountain outside the window full of stories. Silas was, through those months, exactly what she needed him to be, which was present without being intrusive, attentive without being managing, and physically remarkable in every practical way that a pregnancy in a remote mountain cabin in 1879 required. He carried things and lifted things and rearranged the furniture to give her more comfortable access to the desk, and he cooked when she was too tired and did not make anything of it, and he read to her in the evenings from the books on his log shelves when she had used up her words for the day and needed someone else's to fill the quiet, and he chose well. Their son was born on a clear November morning in 1879, with Dr. Briggs present and the mountain outside the cabin window standing in its first winter snow, and they named him James, for her father whose name had been James Dalton, because a name is its own kind of inheritance, and this boy would grow up knowing where he came from. James Silas Slater was 7 pounds and 11 ounces, and extremely opinionated about the world from his first hour in it, which both his parents found entirely characteristic and completely wonderful. He had Silas's gray-green eyes and Edna's particular quality of looking at a thing with full attention, which Silas said was already concerning given how small he was, and how much opinion he was already managing to convey with it. "He's going to be trouble," Silas said, on the second morning, sitting in the chair with his son in his arms with the concentrated care of a man holding something that has rearranged his entire interior understanding of what matters, and his face in the early morning light was a thing Edna would carry with her for the rest of her life, open and overwhelmed and entirely unguarded. "He's going to be wonderful," Edna said. "Both things," Silas agreed. She wrote the next piece for the Gazette when James was 3 weeks old, which she acknowledged was possibly ahead of schedule, but the piece had been arranging itself in her head for the entire last month of the pregnancy and needed to come out. Silas took the baby for the morning hours and walked with him in the cabin and out onto the porch in the November cold, and talked to him about the mountain in the unhurried, informative way. He apparently talked to children the same way he talked to adults, which was directly and with complete respect, and James listened to all of it with those gray-green eyes wide open. Edna wrote 8 pages and sent them with the December mail coach, and then came back inside to the warmth of the cabin and her husband and her son, and sat down in the kitchen, and felt the deep, full satisfaction of a person who is doing exactly everything they meant to do with their life, and doing it in good company. "How did it go?" Silas asked, looking up from where he was sitting with James in his big chair, the baby asleep on his chest with the boneless, absolute trust of the very small. "Well," she said. "Very well." "Good," he said. His voice was quiet because the baby was sleeping, and the cabin was warm and the winter was outside, and he looked at her across the room with everything he felt for her entirely visible, as it had been since August of last year when he had stopped feeling the need to hold it back, and she looked back at him the same way. The years that followed were full ones, the way a life built on purpose and love and good honest work tends to be full. Edna Dalton continued to write for the Eastern Illustrated Gazette and later for 2 additional papers as her reputation grew, and she traveled as she had wanted to Wyoming and New Mexico and California, and once to Washington Territory, always with the specific purpose of finding the stories that needed to be told by someone willing to look at them squarely. She was gone for weeks at a time and came back with notebooks full and words ready. And every time she came back up the trail from Garnet Creek and the cabin came into view through the pines, with smoke from the chimney and the mountain above it, and whatever Silas was doing in the yard, she felt the same absolute and specific sense of rightness. He was always there when she came back, which was the thing she needed most and the thing he gave most willingly. He was not a man given to worry, not the kind that expressed itself in complaint, but she knew from the particular quality of his stillness on the evenings of her return days that he had been counting the days, and she loved him for not making her responsible for that feeling, just for having it quietly and releasing it when she walked through the door. James grew up on the mountain with his father's love of it and his mother's love of language, which was a combination that produced a boy of startling range and occasional magnificent inconvenience. He was walking confidently at 11 months and asking questions by the time he was 2 in a way that required real answers, because he would settle for nothing less, which his parents found exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. By the time James was 3, it was evident that there was going to be another child, and this one arrived in the summer of 1883, on a warm July morning that was unlike the cold November of James's arrival in every way. And she was a girl they named Clara, for no particular literary ancestor, but simply because it was the name that suited her from the first moment she arrived, clear-eyed and interested in everything around her, with an intensity that suggested she was taking notes. "She's going to be a writer," Silas said. "She is absolutely going to be a writer," Edna agreed. "There are going to be 3 of you taking over my cabin with notebooks," he said, looking at Clara in the basket with the expression he had when things were very good, the one that did not quite get all the way to a smile but was something warmer. "You built a big enough desk," Edna said. "I'll build another one," he said. He did 2 years later, when Clara was old enough to sit at something and pretend to write with a bit of charcoal on scraps of paper the way her mother wrote with a pen on proper paper, with the same focused expression and the same particular quality of certainty. Silas built the small desk with the same care he had put into Edna's, same slight angle on the surface, same small drawer for the things a person needed close to hand, and he set it beside his wife's desk in the cabin, and did not say anything about it because he did not need to. Edna was in the cabin that morning when he brought Clara in and showed her the desk, and she watched her daughter look at it, and then look at her father and understand something with those clear eyes, and she wrote it down in the small personal journal she kept that was not for publication, but for the record of the life itself, the one she kept for her own sake. Silas built Clara a desk today. He does not do anything small. The years continued to be full, and the mountain continued to be itself, and the cabin added a room as the children grew and a second bookshelf as the reading material accumulated, and the trapper's cabin up the trail remained Edna's writing place until the end of the 1880s, when the roof finally required more than maintenance and Silas rebuilt it properly over a summer, making the window larger because the light, he said, should be better. James, at 12, had begun writing his own accounts of the mountain and the trapping and the mining operations in the hills, serious, careful accounts that read, Edna told him honestly, like someone paying attention to what mattered. He brought them to her without asking her to be gentle with them, and she was not gentle but was fair, which was exactly what he needed and what she had always given her best subjects. Clara wrote stories. Enormous, sprawling stories about people she invented who did things she imagined, and they were absolutely not publishable at age 7, but were entirely alive, full of the bright particular quality of a mind that finds language genuinely pleasurable. And Edna read every one of them and told her daughter what was true about them with the same care and attention her own father had given her writing when she was young. Silas watched all of this with the quiet pride of a man who knows he has built something, not just the desk and the cabin and the second bookshelf, but something larger and less measurable and entirely real. On the evenings when the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet, and the mountain was doing whatever mountains do in the dark, he and Edna sat by the fire the way they had always sat by fires, in the companionable warmth of people who know each other all the way to the honest core, and talked about everything and nothing, and sometimes nothing at all, because the nothing together was better than anything apart. In 1888, Edna published her first book, a collected and expanded version of her Western series, with 3 additional chapters written specifically for the volume, and it was received with the kind of critical and popular response that moved her editor to write an actual letter rather than a telegram, pages long, full of the kind of breathless gratitude that editors produce when something has succeeded beyond their most optimistic expectation. The book sold in numbers that surprised everyone who had made cautious predictions, and surprised no one who had been reading her work for a decade. She received the letter and the reviews on a Tuesday, sitting at the desk in the trapper's cabin, and she read them through twice, and then sat quietly with the east light on the page and thought about the morning in 1878, when she had arrived in this cabin for the first time and heard nothing but the creek and the woodpecker and the pine wind, and had known immediately that this was the right place to do the work. She walked back to the main cabin in the afternoon and found Silas splitting wood in the yard, which he did with the same unhurried precision as everything else, the axe rising and falling with the full economy of a man who has been doing something long enough that the movement is entirely his. And she walked across the yard and handed him the letter without saying anything, and watched him read it. When he finished, he looked up at her, and the thing in his face was the same thing she had seen the morning she told him about James, and the morning Clara arrived, and the morning she came back from her first long trip and walked up the trail to find him in the yard, the openness and the unguarded joy of a man who does not keep those things from the person he loves. "I told you," he said quietly. "You did," she agreed. "10 years ago," he said, "in a cabin up the trail, I told you that you were doing the thing you were meant to do." "You did," she said. "I was right," he said. "You were," she said. He set the axe aside and pulled her in, the same way he had on all those other mornings, secure and careful and entirely certain. And she stood in the mountain yard with the pines around them, and the high peaks above, and the sound of James somewhere over the hill doing something involving a great deal of noise and probable danger, and Clara's voice carrying from the open window of the cabin where she was arguing with her own story about what ought to happen next, and she thought, this is the whole of it. This is the completed thing, the work and the love and the place and the life, all of it full and present and mine and ours. Silas pressed his lips to her temple and kept one arm around her and looked at the mountain with the reverence she had recognized in him for 10 years, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers where it rested on her shoulder. "What do you want to write next?" he asked. She thought about this. "I have some ideas about New Mexico," she said. "There are things happening there that need a careful eye." "When would you go?" "Spring," she said. "I'd be back by summer." "I'll be here," he said, because that was what he always said and what he always meant. She looked up at him. "I know," she said. And she did know, fully and without any residual doubt, the way you know the things that have proven themselves true over years and seasons and hard winters and good harvests and children who ask impossible questions and books that succeed beyond expectation. The things that have been tested by real life and have come through it not diminished but deepened, not worn out but worn in, like good oak, like a solid cabin on a mountain. Like a writing board made by a father who believed in his daughter and carried with her across the country, until the day she found the right desk to set it on, and the right man to build that desk, and the right mountain to look at while she wrote every true and necessary word. The fire in the cabin that evening burned long and warm, and the mountain outside was absolutely itself in the late summer dark, and the children were asleep, and Silas read aloud from a history he had ordered from Denver while Edna made notes for the New Mexico stories, her pen moving quick and sure across the page, the east light replaced now by lamplight but no less good for the writing, and the sound of his voice low and steady in the room, and the creek outside, and the pines, and all of it exactly right. Completely closed, fully arrived, and entirely theirs.